All right. Well, we have a lot to get through today, so I'll go ahead and get us started. We really want to thank you so much for joining us for today's second program in a five-part series inspired by the semi-quincentennial of the Declaration of Independence. We're on the 250th anniversary of the beginning of the United States of America this year. So here at OHS, one of the things that we like to do is ground ourselves in the place where we are. Wherever we are in the Americas, we are on Indigenous land. And doing this really helps us connect to history and to each other. So this slide tells you a little bit about the place where the Oregon Historical Society is located in downtown Portland, Oregon. These are some of the many languages that have been spoken in this region since time immemorial by some of the peoples who have made their homes here in these homelands. And at the Oregon Historical Society, we've learned from our Native partners and collaborators that acknowledging our place on Indigenous land is important, but also taking action is important. So the wonderful folks at EcoTrust here in Portland, Oregon, have given a list of actions that folks can take. And 3 on your screen right now are ones that are particularly important here at the Oregon Historical Society, where we encourage everyone to challenge and reject stereotypes about Indigenous people. We inform ourselves about issues impacting Indigenous communities and speak up as appropriate, and then also insist that everyone is taught accurate information about the histories, cultures, and contemporary lives of Indigenous people. So here in Oregon, the Tribal History, Shared History curriculum and standards, which are created and shared by the Native nations here in Oregon, can help all of us do that. So we encourage everyone to look up the Tribal History, Shared History materials from the Oregon Department of Education. And speaking of education, if you want to help support the next generation of historians, you can help here in Oregon by being a volunteer Oregon History Day judge. Oregon History Day takes place on April 11th. If you sign up to be a volunteer judge, you get all kinds of amazing resources and training and support. And then you get to go to the campus of Willamette University on April 11th and be there with students to talk to them about their projects, to encourage them in their work of their research and analysis. They all choose their own projects, their own research questions. So this is a really great opportunity to encourage students in their own work of researching and learning and critical thinking. So please consider being a judge. Also, we are so excited about the slate of speakers that we have for the Hatfield Lecture Series this year. You can join the Hatfield Lecture Series in person or online. And we are kicking off on Tuesday with Keisha Blaine's incredible book, Without Fear, Black Women in the Making of Human Rights. It's a wonderful 200-year history of how Black women in the United States have been engaged in international movement for human rights for centuries now. That's followed by several other incredible lectures, and we hope that you all can join us. This program, as I mentioned, is part of a series. Our next program will take place on March 19th, also a Thursday, also at noon, and Bobby Connor and Robert Kenta will be talking about tribal sovereignty and civil rights. This conversation series is really about the idea of the right to be free, inspired, of course, by the Declaration of Independence. What this right means, how we can achieve it. These are questions that are really at the core of American history and life. And this series is designed to bring the Oregon connections, obviously, to some of those big themes. So we've asked experts, like the folks who are joining us today, to share stories and insights from their deep research into Oregon history and to connect them to some of these large themes that are foundational to that complex and often conflicted work of securing justice and freedom for all people. So today, each of our speakers is going to talk for about 12 to 15 minutes, and then we will open the floor to questions. So we really encourage you to put questions in that Q&A, and then we will be able to bring those in and have a virtual conversation together. I'll come back on the screen to facilitate that Q&A after our speakers today. And then as a reminder, all of these recordings for the whole series will be available on ohs.org on the past programs section of our website. We'll wait till they're edited and looking good, so please be patient, but we'll let everyone know by email when those are up there. And then there are also some resources that we have added so that you can learn more about all of the history. So look for those on the websites as well. We're so grateful for all of the speakers in this series whose many years of scholarship are really making the programs possible. So we're also grateful to all of you for taking the time to join us today. So our speakers today, the first speaker will be Chelsea Rose, who is the director of Southern Oregon University Laboratory of Anthropology and a historical archaeologist who focuses on the settlement and development of the American West. Chelsea regularly works with the media, students, and community volunteers to promote archaeological awareness and encourage historical stewardship. She has served on the board of the Oregon Historical Quarterly, was a member of the Oregon Heritage Commission, and is currently on the Board of Trustees for the Southern Oregon Historical Society. She is co-founder and principal investigator for the award-winning Oregon Chinese Diaspora Project and was a guest co-editor of the Oregon Historical Quarterly's special issue on Chinese diaspora in Oregon. She also co-edited the book, Chinese Diaspora Archaeology in North America, which is available from the University Press of Florida. Joining her will be Jerry Garcia, who was born and raised in Quincy, Washington, to a first-generation immigrant parents and is a proud migrant child. Jerry received his BA and MA at Eastern Washington University and earned his PhD from Washington State University. He is the former vice president of medical education for CMAR Community Health Centers and CMAR Museum. Before joining CMAR, he had academic appointments with Iowa State University and Michigan State University. And he is the former director of the Chicano Education Program and College Assistance Migrant Program at Eastern Washington University. His research focuses on Chicano history, Latin American history, history of Mexico, Asians in the Americas, immigration, empire, masculinity, and race in the Americas. And as you can guess from that breadth, he has a lot of publications. He has published over five books and over 15 peer-reviewed articles. His next book, which will be coming out in the next year or so, is El Gallo Negro, Mexican Cockfighting, Culture, and National Identity. And he has two articles coming out this year, one in the Pacific Northwest Quarterly on documenting the history and evolution of the Chicano Latino community in Washington State, and one in the Western Historical Quarterly on deaths in the Bracero program. He is also recognized for his dedication to mentorship and community engagement, often collaborating with local organizations to support educational and cultural initiatives. So please join me in a warm virtual welcome to our speakers, and take it away, Chelsea.
Hi, everybody. I am so excited to participate in this series, and it's an honor to be among such esteemed colleagues like Jerry and this wonderful slate of historians. I'm just really grateful they let an archaeologist sneak in here. So I'm going to be moving through a lot of content pretty quickly because we have a lot we want to cover today. But I wanted to start with, hopefully many of you are familiar with the Oregon Chinese Diaspora Project, which is a collaborative multi-agency partnership that's doing work across the state with a focus on rural areas that once had large Chinese immigrant communities, most of which have no descendants today. And the web of the 19th and 20th century treaties, laws, legal opinions, rules, regulations, and so forth effectively circumscribed the movement and success of many Chinese Oregonians and limited the flow of new immigrants into the US that would have allowed for families to grow and populations to refresh over generations. While the US did not invent exclusion laws, it was unique in individuating the process by evaluating each immigrant's right to enter, and that changed over time. And all of these factors are critical as a backdrop in the lives of all of the Chinese Oregonians that we've been studying. And so I wanted to create part of our website where visitors could interact over space and time to see what types of rules and laws and so forth different Chinese Oregonians were navigated in any one place, whether it's Astoria in 1880 or John Day in 1910. And when I met with the web designers, and some of my colleagues are listed here that helped compile data, it was actually too much data to meaningfully portray spatially. And so that in and of itself, I think, says a lot about the volume of this exclusion and anti-Chinese sentiment that folks had to deal with. And one of the things that I think is really central to that we need to keep in the forefront as we try to do this work is remembering, again, there's too many laws to show efficiently on this one website. And so how do we talk about that and make sure we're engaging with that context, that important context, as we learn about these different Chinese Oregonians over time. Next. So Chinese immigration to the West really started with the gold rush and later the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad and other railroads around the West. And Chinese migrants were pretty much immediately singled out by special rules and taxes and exclusions. And economic scapegoating went full force after the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, when there was lots of folks out of work and looking for work. And a convenient narrative was that Chinese were stealing our jobs. Mei Nai writes about this in her book pictured here, and she was a speaker in the 2023 Hatfield series, and I was hoping you could still see that online, and unfortunately you can't, but you can still get her book. But she really writes about how these tensions were deliberately stoked and evoked for different agendas, to play out different agendas, and a lot of this weaponizing of this language about labor competition really comes out in this era. And this idea that not only are Chinese immigrants competition, but they're unfair competition. And that kind of like extra oomph is something that you can really see in between the lines and sometimes in the lines of a lot of the laws and rules and legislation that followed. Next. These two books by Beth Lou Williams, who is really doing a lot of the heavy lifting about this topic, and I encourage you to check out her 2018 book on the left, is a very comprehensive and accessible overview of the exclusion era, but it really also highlights and kind of asks scholars to tease apart, to not think about this as one monolithic law or moment in time, but to really think more critically about how this was an evolving process and much more nuanced, and also a really recursive process between the US government and Chinese immigrants and Chinese Americans. And her most recent book, John Doe Chinaman, just came out in 2025, and it also explores, you know, this is not just an immigration thing. So it explores the complex web of laws that folks were navigating in a variety of ways in their daily lives. And she breaks it up into three kind of tiers. So one is general outcast laws that, you know, you can see a lot of really loaded newspaper content about Chinatowns being dirty and sanitation and that kind of stuff. Then you have behavior-based laws. And I think these are really interesting because here in Ashland, you have a soap tax. It doesn't say Chinese or China anywhere in the law, but it's targeting these laundries that were a really profitable industry for Chinese Americans and immigrants. Also up in Astoria, there's a law that you can't have things on poles, which is targeting, again, the population working in agriculture and growing a lot of the food that's feeding the community. And the important thing to remember is, like, folks need to understand the context of these laws, or the intended targets could be missed because it's not explicit always. And then you do have the identity-based laws like foreign minors taxes, Oregon has poll taxes, and then the subsequent exclusion laws that come in later. And these all culminate into what Lou Williams thinks about as conditional inclusion. So folks can be here in some instances, but there's all these different things that kind of mitigate how they can participate in American life. And it results in a structural violence that's not always a physical threat. Sometimes it is a very real threat of interpersonal violence, but institutionally sanctioned oppression and discrimination that Chinese Oregonians, again, were navigating on a daily basis. Next slide. Okay, here we go. So as previously mentioned, this Chinese exclusion can best be understood as a progression that evolved over time. And I already told you I couldn't get everything on a website, so don't expect me to get everything in detail in this 10-minute talk. But just to kind of think about how the flow came over time. So many of you are familiar perhaps with the Page Act of 1875, and this restricted Asian women, not just Chinese women, but Asian women from coming to the US because there's an assumption that they would be involved in sex work. And it also restricted forced labor. Now, you might think that that was out of respect for America being a nation of immigrants and wanting them to be free, but it's not. It's because, again, there's an idea that indentured labor would be competition, unfair competition. Next. So we also have the Angel Treaty, which modifies the Burlingame Treaty of 1868. And this is kind of often considered the first time the U.S. restricts free immigration based on race. There was an 1803 federal law that prohibited importation or admission of Negro, mulatto, or persons of color into any state that prohibited them, which was an effort for the government to back Southern states seeking to exclude free Black people. So this isn't really the first time that the federal government is kind of basing these laws on race, but it is the most widely considered, the best known example, I guess. You also get next the Chinese Exclusion Act. There we go, which this is at first only for 10 years, and it first starts out just limiting the amount of folks coming in. In 1888, it becomes more exclusion. And this really is when they start to get into based on class, this idea of laborers are not allowed. If you're a merchant or a scholar, you can come in, but if you're a laborer, you are not allowed. Next. The Exclusion Act is made permanent in 1904, and there is a gazillion amendments and acts in between. Next. And I wanted to also highlight that all in here interspersed with a lot of the things targeting Chinese immigrants and Chinese Americans are a lot of ways that they pushed back. And many of these things are rights that we all enjoy as modern Americans, including the right to asylum that came out of a group of men, over 500 men, who fought with General Pershing against Pancho Villa, working to stop Pancho Villa, and he insisted that they be able to come into the U.S. and be able to live here after that. And then again, there's one about the right to remain silent, which is, of course, is one of the foundational components of Miranda rights. Next. And this is another really famous one, the Geary Act. This marks a really important shift. It extends the Exclusion Act for 10 years. It updates and expands that definition of who is a laborer. And that is, again, informed by, what different industries are too profitable? Let's make them laborers and kind of restrict those folks. And it also requires Chinese immigrants to have residency papers on hand or face immediate deportation. This act also sparked what was the largest act of civil disobedience at the time. Chinese immigrants refused to register. They believed it was unconstitutional, and it made its way all the way through the courts. Unfortunately, it was upheld, and then everybody had to scramble to get their papers before the deadlines. One of the silver linings, if there is one for this, is that it resulted in a lot of a really robust paper trail, including these beautiful portraits of Chinese American men and women for these residency certificates. And Connie Young Yu and Barry Fong are now doing the Geary Act project, where they're working to find these certificates and collect and document them and able to better tell this story and to learn more about these individuals through this underutilized part of material culture of this era. So you can scan that, or I can send the link in the chat later. Okay, next. Birthright citizenship is guaranteed by the 14th Amendment, thanks in part to Wong Kim Ark, who was a San Francisco-born man who challenged the government after he was denied re-entry to the United States after a trip to China. And it eventually his right was upheld, and the Supreme Court ruled, I think it was like 6-2, that people born in the U.S. they have citizenship conferred to them, despite it doesn't matter what the immigration status of their parents are. Next. Okay, and then I wanted to talk a little bit about the Chinese exclusion, how this era and all these immigration laws impacted folks in Oregon specifically. So the Wing Hong Hai Company, this project is led by Eric Gleason and Jackie Chung, who've done a lot of really amazing research on these folks. They had Li Yonghong had a store and laundry, and he owned a restaurant. And he was somebody who was really involved in helping his community navigate this suite of laws over time. And there was over 5 stores, I think, in the Dalles at this time. And the population there did not need 5 Chinese merchandise stores. These were there because this was a way for folks to achieve this privileged status, which would allow them to have transnational mobility and to better access some of the rights of living in the U.S. And okay, let me see here. So one of the things that they did here, you've probably heard of paper sons. So this was a tactic for immigration fraud where you could bring, a resident could bring over somebody saying they were a child, but also there was paper merchants. So folks like Li Hong could sell partnership status in his business for periods of time. And so a lot of times these types of organizations or these businesses had like a rotating cast of characters that came through to have this privileged status so that they could bring their family over or go back to China knowing that they could return to the US. They also could help laborers get labor return certificates. And in order to do that, if you were a laborer and you wanted to go to China and know that you could get back in the US, you had to have $1,000 in assets. And so they would say, a lot of times you see, I gave a loan to whatever store, and everybody would sign off on it. And that would serve as your assets that you would get paid back in theory when you came back. This also is an interesting example of the way that the moving targets of these laws, because it wasn't until the Geary Act that laundries were targeted as labor, restaurants were as well. And those were actually the more profitable enterprises because that was businesses that served, they were facing the larger community so they could make more money. So when Li Hong wanted to bring his family over, he was denied because he had a laundry in his business. So he had to literally put up a wall and disarticulate the two businesses and say, nope, I just have a store, I don't have a laundry. And then finally it was approved that his family could come over. And then I wanted to, I'm sure I'm running out of time, but I just wanted to say that all of the processes of the immigration, this immigration part was commodified and profiteering was happening on both sides. And as it got more detailed and more onerous, it ironically got more predictable and easier to circumvent. And it was seen as morally unjust by, many Chinese immigrants, and therefore they felt it was reasonable to not comply. But one of the other things that I think is interesting about this example, that Li Hong was also involved in bypassing the immigration system altogether by helping to smuggle individuals across the Mexican border. And he was caught at one point with 3 individuals that he was smuggling over and old ID papers. And some and he got away with it. I can't remember exactly what happened, but this was a way that he was also bringing folks into places like Oregon. Some estimate that over 17,000 Chinese immigrants crossed the Mexican border between 1882 and 1920, and this is what one of legal scholars has said was the first making of the first illegal American. Illegal immigrant in the US. So on that, I'm going to share or send it over to my colleague, Jerry, to have him take it away and talk about his section of this. So thank you.
Thank you, Chelsea. First, I want to reach out and say real quick, thank you to Eliza and the Oregon Historical Society for inviting me and to have this honor to present what I can today on the Mexican and Mexican-American experience, especially in regards to the idea of immigration, deportations, etc., in regards to that experience. And so, based on Chelsea's presentation, she covered some areas that very helpful for my presentation, so I won't have to linger too long. I can bypass a couple of slides. But before I start off, one of the things I want to thank Lisa for doing the land acknowledgement. I think that's so important for a variety of different reasons. And I'm going to mention just one here. Because oftentimes when we talk about history, whether we're talking about, kind of like what we call mainstream U.S. history, Mexican American history, etc., we often forget that Mexico and the United States are very similar in some respects. Perhaps not language, but in other respects. And what I mean by that is this, that both areas were invaded and conquered by Europeans. So there's a European colonial legacy in what we call today United States and Mexico. And part of that legacy is in regards to the treatment of indigenous peoples. Oftentimes I get into a conversation about this with my classes that I teach, And I want to be sure that people in general and students in particular understand that when we're talking about things such as settler colonialism, invasion and conquest, genocide, that happened throughout the Western Hemisphere because Europeans conquered the whole region and they had very similar policies in regards to the treatment of Native Americans. Now, there might have been some nuances in regards to that treatment, but in the end, New Spain, which was the colony of Spain, what we call today Mexico and other areas of the Western Hemisphere, had a very similar mentality and image of Native Americans. And that's a long history, a dark history that involves very similar things in regards to the colonial empires known as the British Empire and what we call today the United States. Christianity played a huge role in regards to attempts to destroy the indigenous populations throughout the Americas, whether you're a Protestant or a Catholic, same, very similar policies, again with some nuances. So again, I want to thank Eliza for reminding us that no matter where we're at, whether we're in the United States, Mexico, Guatemala, Argentina, anywhere in the Caribbean, we are on indigenous lands, and we can't forget that. And so, with that, then let me move on in regards to my presentation. There's a lot of information that, as you saw from Chelsea's presentation, we have a lot to say, but very little time to get it done. And so, this is going to be a really quick overview of 175 years of history, more or less. And so, I start off with this slide here, basically because I want to show a little bit about the overall treatment of Mexican immigrants and Mexican Americans. And then whenever I can, I'll tie it into the Oregon experience as we go through my slides. And so I'm not sure how well it's showing up, but that document that I have on this slide, at the very top on the right side of the text, is a death certificate of a bracero worker from the 1940s. And I've been doing a study on this for the last several years. And what I've have found are over 315 deaths of braceros, including in the state of Oregon. And so I wanted to kind of highlight that with this particular death certificate because of the cause of death. And I got the cause of death over here in text where it says top right image death certificate for Bracero Andres Hernandez, February 1st, 1945, Lovelock, Nevada. Cause of death, strangulation, self-inflicted. So I want to pause this for a second and I want you to imagine for a moment being in the shoes of Andres Hernandez in the 1940s in the United States as a contract laborer. Something occurred that put him in a jail where the following day he was found hung. Unfortunately, that kind of scenario should resonate with us because we continue to find those kind of situations in the contemporary period where we'll have people who are jailed for whatever reason and then are found dead the following day, second day, third day, or a week later. Now, you got to understand this is the 1940s. Even though Mexico and the United States were allies in World War II, we cannot forget the fact that there was rampant racism and discrimination against Mexicans in the United States. And so it's just a kind of a cautionary kind of a warning to understand these 315 death certificates that I found. 1%, a little bit over 1%, nearly 2% are from suicides very similar to this. Okay. And so to hear the further story on this, I got an article coming out on this in the Western Historical Quarterly later this year. And hopefully you can read that, get some more details. Next slide, please. So then this is a question that I pose to a lot of audiences, right? If you know Mexican American history, Latino history in general, right? One of the questions that I've always asked myself as a Latino somebody who identifies as a Chicano, but as a person of Mexican ancestry, born and raised in the United States. Question I always ask is, why has there been such animosity directed towards Mexicans, Latinos in the United States? Since the invasion and conquest and incorporation of the first Latino group, Mexicanos, back in 1848, that has not ceased. This continuation of attack, violence, structural violence that Chelsea mentioned earlier continues into the contemporary period. So one of the things that I always ask my students when I'm in my classes is to try to answer that question. Now they won't answer it in the first week, first month, second month, but by the time of the end of the semester, they should have a general idea or understanding why this has taken place over the long durée of nearly over 175 years. Next slide, please. And so the Mexican-American War, I won't linger too long on this, but very important because this talks about the U.S. invasion and conquest of 51% of Mexico's territory, northern territory, what we call today the American Southwest. I think everybody knows this, but I just want to repeat it. What we call today the American Southwest was part of Mexico's northern territory, right? So this is where my initial comments come into play, right? There's tremendous amount of contradiction in this history, right? So we're talking about here we got the United States invading Mexico, right? At the end of this war, and with the purchase of the Gadsden Prussians of 1853, Mexico has essentially lost 51% of its territory. But we can't forget that territory was originally indigenous. So Spain took it from indigenous people. Mexico inherited through their War of Independence, but it is originally indigenous people's land. So we always got to remember that. And sometimes it's difficult to understand that trajectory of history. Because when you look at the Mexican-American experience, Latino experience, you have all these intersecting histories coming into play. Whether we're talking about the 18th century, 19th century, or the 21st century, that is still taking place. Now, the Mexican-American War, of course, there's a legacy that is still playing out to this day. And what's happening, unfortunately, in the contemporary period with the Trump administration 2.0, that legacy is playing out today. And going back to my focus question, that might help you a little bit to understand why there has been such animosity directed towards Latinos, right? And perhaps because they are original inhabitants to the Americas and they pose a threat to some people. Okay. Next slide, please. So Mexican immigration, it's very little Mexican immigration in the context that you might think about it in today's context, right? Can't go through all these bullets, but one of the things I want to highlight is that in the first couple of decades of the 20th century, Mexican immigration was under the radar. Mexicanos represented maybe 2% of the total movement of immigrants to the United States. The groups that had the target on their backs, that eventually laws would be created to prevent their movement, are groups like Chelsea mentioned: Chinese, Japanese, later Koreans, etc. And then, of course, groups from Eastern and Southern Europe were the main targets for a lot of the anti-immigrant legislation that's going to emerge. But there's a tremendous amount of backlash against Mexicans nonetheless, right? That's not difficult to understand, but it's history that if you're interested in Mexican immigration or just immigration history here in the United States, that it's important that you understand these kind of nuances and that you understand things like the 1917 Immigration Act, the 1921 Immigration Act, and then, of course, the one, although it's being challenged today, but back in this time period before 2017, the 1924 Immigration Act of the United States was considered the most racist immigration act ever created by the United States because it was based on national origins, which meant that essentially people of color were being barred. It sounds a little familiar. Were being barred back in the early 20th century, or people that didn't look like Protestants were being barred. And of course, the Asian triangle was being barred during this time period. But who wasn't barred with the 1924 Immigration Act? Mexicanos. All right. And so there's a tremendous amount of great history on this. But the overriding reason is because the United States was closing off all immigrant labor. So it still needed a labor force. And what better force to have than a disposable labor right across the border? Okay, next slide. And of course, here, this is a very important slide in regards to looking at the Mexican Latino population. It was very small during this time period. I do want to make a quick kind of caveat. When we look at immigration from Latin America into the United States, it's primarily for a very long time what we call a Mexican affair. It's probably Mexicanos who are immigrating to the United States. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't find a Cubano or Puerto Riqueño, right, or other Latin Americans coming into the United States, but the numbers are so small that they're not having an impact on the demographics of the United States. So up until the mid to late 20th century, you really don't see a diverse movement of Latin American immigrants until we begin to see the chaos and disruption that's being caused by U.S. foreign policy in places like Central America, Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, and then in the Caribbean with Cuba. But that's not going to take place until the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So up until then we got primarily Mexicans who were part of the United States because of the invasion and conquest, and then through what we would call normal immigration in the early part of the 20th century. And as you can see here, you know, the population of Latinos in the United States is not even 2 million. You know, up in the Northwest, Washington has 3,200. Oregon, 1,568 in 1930s. You can add 5 to 10% to those totals because of the undercount. Still, it gives you small numbers. We won't see these numbers really begin to grow in numbers until post-World War II. Okay, next slide. But nonetheless, you still see this attack against Mexicans. I think one of the most important things that I can leave you with today is this pattern of attacking Mexican immigrants, Mexican Americans, that begins in the early part of the 20th century. And as we all know, unfortunately, continues into the very present time period. All right. So here then, and I say this kind of loosely, I often have trouble kind of articulating this idea, but what's happening today is nothing new to Latinos. Unfortunately, we've experienced it over and over and over again as being the scapegoats when it comes to immigrants, when it comes to rationalizations for deportations and roundups. And 1930s is probably one of the best examples that we have. And so then when we look at the 1930s, then it's really the economic fallout that's happening in the United States caused by the crash of the 1929 stock market. But the United States has got to find a culprit in regards to that. And who better than that culprit be the most vulnerable population in the country, who are Mexicans and Mexican Americans, right? And here then we got all Latinos, very similar like today, being lumped together. Okay, so racial profiling is alive and well in the 1930s and even before. So the one image though that I want you to pay attention to on this slide is that woman holding that sign, because it shows you the resistance and the community organizing that we're going to see from the early part of the 20th century all the way to the contemporary period that has shown this mobilization of the community and resistance towards these very draconian laws that have emerged over and over and over again, attacking immigrant communities in general, but particularly here in my presentation, the Mexicano Latino community. And to have the courage as one person holding one sign on that sidewalk in Los Angeles, that takes a tremendous amount of courage to do that. The only other image that resonates with me in regards to this, I'm not sure if many of you have ever seen this image, but it's of a Nazi rally in Nazi Germany in the 1930s, where all the Nazi drones are doing the Hitler salute. And if you look closely at the image, there's one individual who refused to salute. And in fact, he's very defiant. Rather than having his hands just down, he's got him crossed in defiance, saying, I am not going to salute this madman known as Hitler. So we got these kind of examples throughout history where it just takes one person to create this idea of resistance and mobilization that brings the community along. And there's no better example than looking at this protester in Los Angeles in 1937. And there, to kind of connect it to Oregon, one of the mechanisms that were used throughout the country was coercion, right? So there might not have been guns directed at Mexicans or Mexican Americans, right? But they were felt they were made to feel unwelcome in their communities, including communities in Oregon. And because of that feeling, they left because they were being forced to through coercion. All right. And so this is an example that occurred not just in Oregon, but in California. I mean, literally everywhere during the 1930s, leading up to the 1940s. Next slide. These are the examples I just mentioned, so I won't linger too long on this slide. But resistance has always been critical. I mean, this idea of showing a sense of agency is so important. No matter how big or how small this resistance is, it's important to understand that the Chicano Latino community in the United States has never succumbed to their victimization. They have always resisted their oppression. And these are good examples on this slide of how that manifested and continues to manifest to this day. Okay, next slide. And then, the Bracero program. I mentioned it, I already introduced it, but it's a program. A lot of people confuse with immigration, but it's not necessarily immigration. What it is a bilateral treaty signed between the United States and Mexico during World War II that was eventually extended until 1964 to bring in contract workers on short contracts, anywhere from 6 months to 12 months in duration, and then they would return back to Mexico. Now, where some people might confuse that is because there are going to be a lot of neglect on both sides of this program. The growers, the U.S. government, the Mexican government, and the workers themselves will break the treaty over and over and over again. And from the workers' perspective, one of the main areas that you'll witness in regards to the violation of the treaty is leaving their contract, breaking their contract, and going into the United States without a contract. And then they become what we call today undocumented workers. But the majority, though, fulfilled the obligations of their contract, worked for 6 months to 12 months out of the year, and then went back to Mexico. And if they wanted to, they could renew their contract and return. That was primarily the mechanism. So this is the program that I'm studying, that I'm publishing an article on, that has been studied over and over again. There are probably thousands, hundreds of articles, hundreds of books have been published on this program, but very few have ever examined in detail the deaths that occurred. My study only examines it from the World War II period. Okay, next slide. Sorry, Lisa, going crazy. Okay. Yeah, so again, just images, the Bracero program. These are actually all from the special archives, special collections at Oregon State University. They have a wonderful collection of the Bracero program there, great images. If you're looking for images, if you're doing some study on Braceros in Oregon, I highly recommend going to the Oregon State University Special Collections and taking a look at these images, because as I tell my students, images tell you a lot about history. Right? And of course, most of these pictures here are posed images. The only one that's not posed is the very top one where the Braceros are arriving in Hood River. They're just getting off the train that transported them there. That's probably the only one that's not posed, but the other ones are. Nevertheless, they give you some insight into the conditions, the work that Braceros did in Oregon, obviously primary agriculture, but the other industry is very important for us to remember is that Braceros also worked in the railroad industry, where the majority of the deaths would occur during especially during that time period that I'm studying. But let's not forget the program actually goes well beyond World War II. Next slide. So here then, this is the only time that I will ever say the W word, is because this was the actual military nomenclature that was given to a immigration operation known as Operation Wetback. In fact, the current program that's in place by the Trump administration, this is their template right here. Operation Wetback between 1954 and 1957. The administration, particularly the guy that I hope eventually goes to jail, Stephen Miller, went back to this program, took out what he could, and is utilizing it right now in the United States in regards to using these draconian tactics, rounding up anybody that looks brown and deporting them to their so-called place of origin. Even U.S. citizens, even people who are legal residents in this country. Then, of course, um, very similar to the contemporary period, what we saw in the 30s and the 1950s here are the same kind of tactics, right? Mexican Americans were deported, Latino Americans were deported, people with no violent crimes were deported, families were deported. And let's have no misconception. One of the things that you'll read about this history is that the majority of the people who were U.S. citizens were children born to Mexican immigrants. That is a myth. That is a fallacy. A large section of the population that was deported in the 1930s and 1950s were adult Mexican Americans, Latino Americans. And so you can see then if you are of the stripe that you want to inflict terror and fear on the immigrant community, this is the operation you go back to and you deploy in 2025 and in 2026, which is what the Trump administration is currently doing. Next slide. The picture on the right is basically why I showed this slide. It's this accident here that happens in California, a place called Chula, California, that many people argue was basically the last kind of nail in the coffin of the Bracero program. Now, there are a variety of different reasons. I got some listed there why the Bracero program ended, right? But when you have the continued high number of deaths of Braceros, then it's going to have a huge impact of whether or not this program is going to be renewed. And so there's a great historian by the name of Lori Flores. She's written an article in a book about this situation. I highly recommend it. But this is just a newspaper article talking about this accident that occurred in 1963 that eventually helped people decide that, okay, this program's got to come to an end for a variety of reasons. But as my study will show later on, tremendous amount of negligence in regards to braceros that were essentially seen as disposable labor. And one of the things that I argue to prove that point is that when you look at all these deaths, I found 315. I didn't find them by accident. I actually went looking for them. But because I ran out of time, I had to stop at 315. I assume there are a lot more. And then, of course, I don't go beyond World War II. So if we were to add this 28, another 50 something that were killed in an airplane accident and all the single type accidents that occurred until the end, then we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of braceros that were killed during this time period. And in all that history, not one individual was ever held to account for one single death. Not one. Not one single individual or company or grower or corporation or railroad company. Right? So that's a telltale sign about the views and treatment and neglect of Mexicans and how their bodies were viewed during this time period. Next slide. Chelsea would know this pretty well, so I'm not gonna go over this. If you understood what Chelsea was talking about in regards to all these immigration policies, the only one that I'll highlight here is the 1965 Immigration Act. That is the one that the Trump administration, especially Stephen Miller, wants to undo. Why? Because it's about family reunification. And that's what helped us build the diverse communities that we have today was through the 1965 Immigration Act that allowed immigrants who became legal residents to bring in their families. Right? And so it's a program that wasn't initially designed for that, but because of the various components of it, it allowed for this to occur. And so then over time, all the way to the contemporary period, we see family reunification being the major impetus for the growth of the immigrant population in the United States. Next slide. So again, this is contemporary stuff. If you're familiar with what is Trump's doing in the contemporary period, this is what this slide speaks to, right? Beginning in 2017 with the wall, and now using a secret police force known as ICE, to go into various communities, including in Oregon, to terrorize immigrants and the communities in general. Because it's not just the immigrants are being terrorized, it's the communities. And regardless of what ethnicity you are, those ICE agents are terrorizing our communities. And so I'm hoping that we see the end of this very, very soon. And we have to give credit again where credit is due. Places like Oregon, Washington, Texas, California, Minneapolis. Minneapolis, we got to give a shout out to Minneapolis for standing their ground in regards to the immigration enforcement that's happening there. And then my last reading is that uh, ICE is pulling out of Minneapolis as we speak. Last slide or next slide. Just a resource page. We're going to have this up later on that you can go to. Just a lot of different books that you can engage if you want to learn more about anything I spoke about. This is just a list of resources you can go to. Next slide. And then, of course, I still get emotional about this last slide. If you had the opportunity to see this halftime performance, we were all Puerto on Sunday. If the people that went to the alternate halftime performance, they missed out. If they believe in family values, if they believe in community unity, if they believe in this idea of freedom, if they believed in an all-American celebration, you saw that at halftime in Santa Clara, California, through Bad Bunny's performance. It was beautiful. And of course, the last image that he showed was that sign that I got there that I just copy and pasted. It says the only thing more powerful than hate is love. And I truly believe in that. And I have no doubt that in the end, that's how we're going to overcome what is taking place today in the United States, is through love and not hate. Thank you.
Thank you so much, both of you. Jerry and Chelsea, if you'll have both of you keep your cameras on, we'll do some Q&A. I would really invite audience members to put your questions in the Q&A box or in the chat. Otherwise, I get to ask whatever my questions are, but we'd love to have yours. Jerry, turn your camera back on so we can see you again.
I just had to wipe away. I had to wipe away some tears.
I understand. Yeah, I got to have mine wiped away while I still had the camera off. So thanks for that powerful presentations and ending. And I wanted to ask, there was, when you put up your focus question, Jerry, that said, why has there been this bad treatment for so long of Mexicanos in the United States, or Latina people in the United States? And a couple folks in the chat said profit, money motive, people over profit, exploitation of people, these kinds of things. And it made me think about these histories of labor contracting, which is part of both of the histories that you all talked about. Can you talk some about that sort of how these federal policies and then individual pushbacks, but how that intersects with these histories of labor contracting and who's controlling those labor contracts?
Chelsea, you want me to do that or you want to go for it? Okay. Well, let me address the focus question.
Sure.
Because I think it has less to do with economics and more to do with culture and belonging, right? But also, this is why, I prefaced my conversation with your land acknowledgement, Elisa, and then a little bit about the colonial history on today's both sides of the border, right? And so, like, for example, I'm often caught saying that Mexicanos are one of the few groups that can claim a rightful ownership to the land that was stolen from Mexico, right? And in fact, this idea plays out violently, especially in the early part of the 20th century, through another terror organization that's known today in history as the Texas Rangers, right? And so then what I argue, and it's part of the puzzle, is that when you look at Mexicanos and you look at the 51% of the territory that was taken, and the other thing I didn't get a chance to mention is you have to remember through an accident of history, Mexicanos who were conquered and remained in the conquered territories were literally made U.S. citizens overnight, right? And I say that by accident because I don't think the architects of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo really understood what they had created. Because had they understood it, They would have created something more like the 1898 treaty that ended the Spanish-American War, where Puerto Ricanos had to wait until 1917 to become U.S. citizens. But Mexicanos had to do it overnight. So then when we look at this time period, then there's no doubt that cheap labor is going to play a huge role, right? But it doesn't really answer the question is that cheap labor in many ways, especially during its early formative years after the conquest and leading into the early part of the 20th century, doesn't really explain its animosity, right? I argue that it's more about access to the land, ownership to the land, and then coupled with that, right, is culture. And you see this play out over and over and over again in the late 19th century, and you can even argue to this day. And the one example that I'll give you is that a overwhelming number of Latin Americans, right, are Catholics still, even though Protestant denominations have made some inroads. The example I'm going to show you in regards to attack to their culture is that the culture icon for Latin America is La Virgen de Guadalupe, right? The Virgin of Guadalupe, right? But because she was associated with Spanish Catholicism, she was relegated to the basements of all the Catholic churches in the United States, right? So then, if we want to bring in some economic components to this, then I think the argument to be made is that Mexico needed a form of cheap labor, right? Especially as we go into the late 19th century, early 20th century, going back to a comment that I made that the United States was pretty much tapping down all the immigrant labor, except for Mexicanos. And so they're being used as a form of labor that continued to be brought in, right? And you look at the history and development of the Southwest, because what you have to understand is what did the Southwest look like in 1900? Oh, very different, even from 2 or 3 decades in. And what they needed was an army of laborers, not just for the agricultural fields, but for the development of that region, to build the canals, the dams, etc. Multiple groups were used, but one of the major groups that were being used were Latin Americans, Mexicanos during this time period. So at least I always argue that it's this attachment to the land, right, that Mexicanos have claim to, right? And Mexicanos also, we can't forget, are indigenous people, right? My mother is part Hopi, but I didn't grow up in the Hopi culture. I grew up in a traditional Mexican culture, and that's what I associate with. I also know that I am also a descendant of the Spanish colonizers, but I don't associate with that colonialism because I grew up in a Mexican household, Mexican traditions, and that's where my perspective in regards to my identity comes from, right? And so, but I'm familiar with this history, and yeah, Chelsea, if you want to chime in here and add anything from your perspective, that'd be wonderful. But also, I would love to hear, maybe from what the audience folks are thinking about this.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing when it comes to labor and the Chinese immigrant and Chinese American community. I think that a lot of times the labor had a very specific meaning. It was a term of art used in the immigration policies, but also it has been used as one of the mechanisms of erasure of the many different Chinese Oregonians that had different types of lives that they were building in the state. For example, in the mining industry, we've done a lot of work in Eastern Oregon, and these Chinese American mining companies were working for themselves, for their own profit. And down here in Southwest Oregon, there was a Chinese American labor boss who had, Chinese men working for him. So there was a lot of different ways that folks were performing labor, and it wasn't always for other people. And I think that, with some populations that gets lost, and it's part of the mechanisms that defines folks as like these perpetual foreign populations, by making them be like unnamed laborers. So that's just one other added nuance, I think.
Yeah, I appreciate that. There's a comment in the chat box that is, having to do with people coming and doing labor and then going back to other countries, right? So thinking about folks coming from Mexico in the 60s and 70s, laboring in Oregon and elsewhere, and then going back. And I'm interested in that, but also interested in, we talked about this conversation series around the right to be free, right? And so what I know today, and also from these histories, people's ability to travel freely within the United States or internationally from the United States. Can you talk some about how restrictions on that ability are part of the histories that you all have studied, that sort of just ability to physically move oneself around within the
Right.
United States and from the United
Yeah.
States back and forth to other countries as well?
Well, we can start from the current period where now it's a challenge, right? Because of the Trump administration and the restrictions that they have. And even though somebody might have, right, the so-called documents to come and go in this country, many aren't doing that because of the fear, right, of leaving the country and maybe not getting back in, even though they have that ability to come in. So the tremendous amount of racial profiling. I mean, unfortunately I started carrying my passport 6 months ago. Yeah, even though I was born and raised in this country, I now carry my passport because of the racial profiling that is ongoing. Now, has it always been like this? No, absolutely not. Right? There were times in our history and recent history where people had the freedom and mobility to go back and forth between whatever borders they choose to cross, whether it's the U.S. Mexican border or further on south or going into Europe or Asia, right, or Africa, right? And so we cannot forget this aspect of the contemporary period where you can easily see this. So what I'm about to say is not something that I'm conjuring up out of the blue air, but there's no doubt the Trump administration is racially profiling people of color and encouraging white immigration to this country. Now, we don't have time to go into a deeper conversation on that, but as a historian, right, and understanding demographics in this country and where they're at right now and where they're projected to be in the near future, right, there's no doubt there's people in the Trump administration that have this idea that the white population is disappearing and being supplanted, right, by people of color, right? And so that can be looked at more closely, but it's simply not true, right? Simply not true. And so then, when we look at, for example, I'll give you the example of my own family experience. My parents came in. Uh, my father and mother came in with their parents in the 1950s and 1960s, a totally different time period in regards to immigration. All my grandfather needed to legalize his whole family of 12 was an employer's voucher. All he needed was the employer to say, yes,
Mhm.
Juan Garcia, his wife and his 12 children work for my farm and I'm vouching for them. And that's all they needed to get legalized, right? The residential green, quote unquote, green card, right? That's unheard of today, right? And so then there's also, one of the things we have to understand is also this movement, right, of immigrants. And one of the things that I'm familiar with, and I'm very happy that Eliza shared this with me earlier, is that in Oregon, looking at Professor Len Stevens' work, we know that there was tremendous amount of trans-border communities being created in Oregon from very indigenous groups who migrated out of Mexico, Guatemala, and migrated into Oregon after stepping through various places, but ended up in Oregon, where they created communities there, but also had their community in their place of origin, and they would travel back and forth, right? That's very difficult today uh, to see that occurring. And it might, as I mentioned, it might be that these indigenous communities are here legally as refugees. They have the paperwork, they have the visas, they have their green card, or they're citizens. But would you risk going back to your place of origin, not knowing that you might not be able to come back to your children? Right? Those are the decisions and dilemmas that face these immigrant communities in the contemporary period because of what has taken place at the highest level of our government in regards to the crackdown, the terror. I should call it terror, call it what it is, right? And so I'll leave my comments at that for right now.
Chelsea, do you want to speak to those restrictions or lack thereof in the work you've studied?
Yeah, I can just say that that was a very tricky thing for Chinese Americans, no matter what their immigration status was. And even folks that were born here or were citizens, there was always the worry they wouldn't be able to come in and they wouldn't be able to bring their family over. So this was like a constant, struggle. And the barriers, even for folks that could follow these processes, whether to become merchants or to get labor certificates that they could return with, they were expensive and time consuming. So there was a lot of barriers for folks going back and forth to their home villages. And there's a lot of letters back, because of course people were homesick and people missed their family and friends. And there's a lot of letters that were written between these two communities. And they've been understudied and underutilized. And I know that there were some volumes coming out in China that had some of these letters, and I really look forward to those kind of entering into the scholarly literature, because I think that would give us like firsthand accounts of what that would have been like to not be able to just go home and visit your family, or when your parent is sick or something like that.
Yeah, I'll just add this as a thought, trading off of Chelsea's comment, is that so there's no doubt. I mean, when you look at the history of immigrants coming to this country, regardless of the time period, but I'm going to speak specifically from the Latino Mexican perspective. There's no doubt that there has been a long history of this movement back and forth between, let's say, Mexico and the United States, and some of it being done by undocumented immigrants who would return back and then cross again, right, with the help of coyotes coming into the country, right? So then what I would ask people to do is to examine the system that created that, right? And part of that system is all of us, right? Because we crave cheap products, we crave cheap produce, right? So we create this mechanism that we want cheap labor to come in. So our lettuce is not $10 a head when we go to the store. Rather, it's I don't know what it is these days. Unfortunately, I don't eat enough vegetables, as they say. But it'd be a lot more expensive than it is today. And so then we are also culprits in this whole design that we're looking at because of our consumerism, right? And our kind of appetite for cheap products, whether it's agricultural products or the clothes that we wear. We created this system, and then we created this system that allowed these folks to stay and become part of our community, right? We allowed them to stay for 10, 20, 30 years, and they became tied to our communities. And then we're trying to uproot them after all that time period of allowing them to be part of our community, right? So there's no doubt then there was a major failure in this country in 2007 when immigration reform failed. And it hasn't been back on the table for nearly 20 years. When there was a potential a possibility of creating a new immigration system that would recognize the contributions that these long-term immigrants made, regardless of their status that they had made to the country and to their communities. Right? And so we're at, you know, back to square one, so to speak, in regards to that. So then I would ask us to think about that from your kind of perspective and the world that you live in, and what can we do as a community? What can we do as individuals to make this better, right? A better place. And the last note I'll make on that is the unfortunate thing is that with the ending of the Bracero program, you saw a dramatic increase in undocumented immigration. And it's very simple to understand is that many of those braceros who could no longer come under contract just returned back to their place of work in the United States without the contract. And of course, when they're coming in that way, they're coming in undocumented, right? And they're being, of course, who's waiting for them are the growers with open arms because they crave their labor, right, for their industry. Right? So I'll stop there for that.
Well, I appreciate this. There's so much gratitude for both of you in the chat. And
Thank
There are some amazing questions in the Q&A that I promised our presenters I would let them move on to their next commitments in their day. So we're not going to get to them, but I want to draw from those to just encourage folks to think about some of the themes that are brought up in the Q&A. One is the reality of whiteness, this legal reality and cultural reality of whiteness, and to consider ways that that plays into these histories and these realities. Also international relations. And so how does the intersection between the labor pool sort of ideas that Jerry was just talking about, how does that play in with international politics as well as domestic politics? How do these kinds of histories and events shape the way that people vote, or the way that voting becomes itself a politicized event? I mean, obviously, but who has access to voting, right? Those interplays. And then finally, a wonderful question about solidarity, right? And how Mexican and Chinese and other immigrant communities may be working together across those racial differences to work for the right to be free, as is our framing idea here for the series. So we will see folks next month for Robert Kenta and Bobby Connor talking about tribal sovereignty and civil rights. We'll get the recording out to everyone. You'll get a follow-up email from us, but reach out to OHS if you've got additional questions, and please keep reading, talking, learning about all of these various aspects of history that are so present with us today. Chelsea, Jerry, everyone who's here with us, thank you all very much and have a wonderful day. Take care.
you for all the great questions, everybody. Bye-bye.